Okay, so this is my second video, third attempt at it. So hopefully this is going to work this time. So now we're going to talk about Sparta. And we're going to begin with, make sure I'm in the right spot, the Spartan economy. So while the Athenian economy depended on trade, Sparta's economy relied on farming and conquering other people. Sparta didn't have enough land to feed all its people, so the Spartans took the land they needed from their neighbors. Because Spartan men spent their lives as warriors, Sparta used slaves and not as citizens to produce needed goods. The Spartans turned the neighbors they conquered into slaves called helots. Helots continued to live in their own villages, but they had to give much of the food that they grew, to the Spartan citizens. The Spartans also made use of non-citizens called parakoi. Parakoi were free men, not slaves. They might serve in the army when needed, but they could not take part in Sparta's government. The parakoi made such necessary items as shoes, red cloaks for the soldiers, iron tools like knives and spears, and pottery. They also conducted some trade with other city-states for goods that Sparta could not provide for itself. In general, though, Sparta discouraged trade. The Spartans feared the contact with other city-states would lead to new ideas and weaken their government. Trading with Sparta was also difficult because of its own system of money. Sparta didn't have coins. Instead, it used heavy iron bars as money. Legend says that an ancient Spartan leader decided to use iron as money to make it hard to steal. A thief would need a wagon to carry enough iron bars to be valuable. As you imagine, other city-states were not anxious to receive iron as a payment for goods. Okay, so who is important or what is important about Sparta's economy, right? So they didn't depend on trade. They were kind of self-sufficient, but they didn't have enough land to feed all its people. So they would just go in and take it from their neighbors. They were I always think of bullies when it comes to Spartans, okay? And they had slaves, and they were called helots, or those were the conquered people. And then we had the parakoi, which were free men. They weren't slaves, but they weren't really able to participate in the government. So that's Spartan's economy. They didn't have coins, didn't really have money, didn't really want to trade. So they made it possible, kind of impossible, by having iron bars for their currency. Spartan government. Sparta was different from Athens in almost every way, beginning with its government. While Athens was a democracy, Sparta was an oligarchy. As you learned in chapter 26, an oligarchy was the ruling in an oligarchy, the ruling power is in the hands of a few people. Like Athens, Sparta had an assembly, but the important decisions were really made by a much smaller group called the Council of Elders. The Council of Elders consisted of 2 kings and 28 other men. The 2 kings inherited their position and shared equal powers. The other 28 members of the council were elected by the assembly. To be elected to the Council of Elders, men had to be at least 60 years old from a noble family. Some scholars believe that the assembly members shouted for the man they wanted most. The candidates who received the loudest support were elected. Once they were elected, they served for life. The Council of Elders held the real power in Sparta. It prepared laws for the assembly to vote on, and it had the power to stop any laws passed by the assembly that the council members didn't like. The assembly in Sparta was made up of male citizens. Because the assembly was large, it met in a large outdoor area away from the center of the city. The assembly had very little power. Unlike the assembly in Athens, it did not debate issues. Members of the assembly could only vote yes or no on the laws suggested by the Council of Elders. So, important about Sparta. They were an oligarchy. So, an oligarchy is where there's ruling power is in the hands of a few. So, we had the Council of Elders. They were made up of 2 kings and 28 other men. And the assembly, they had an assembly, but the assembly didn't really have the power that it did in Athens. Okay, so that's our government of Sparta. Now we're going to move on and talk about education. In Sparta, the purpose of education was to produce men and women who could protect the city state. If a baby did not appear healthy and strong, it might be left to die on a hillside. Spartans valued discipline and strength. From the age of 7, all Spartan children were trained to fight. Even girls received some military training. They learned wrestling, boxing, foot racing, and gymnastics. Spartan boys lived and trained in buildings called barracks, which you should know that that's one of our vocabulary words. They were taught to read and write, but Spartans did not consider those skills important. What was important was to be a brave soldier. Spartan boys were taught to suffer any amount of physical pain without complaining. They marched without shoes, they were not fed well, and they were encouraged to steal food as long as they did not get caught. One Spartan legend tells of a boy who stole a fox because he was starving. When he saw his teacher coming, the boy quickly hid the fox under his cloak. Rather than confess, he let the fox bite his stomach. At the age of 20 or so, Spartan men were given a difficult test of fitness, military ability, and leadership skills. If they passed, they became Spartan soldiers and full citizens. Even then, they continued to live in soldiers' barracks, where they ate and slept and trained with their classmates. A man could not live at home with his wife and family until he was 30 years old, and his military service continued long after that. So, education, much different in Sparta, right? Focus was much different. It was not on reading, writing, math, arithmetic. It was discipline, it was strength, it was training to fight, it was military training. Military was very important in Sparta, a lot more important than in Athens. Athens, it really isn't mentioned. Okay, women and slaves in Sparta. Spartan women lived the same simple life as a Spartan man. They wore plain clothing with little decoration. They did not wear jewelry or use cosmetics. I apologize, guys and ladies. When I printed this out, it cut it off again. I don't know why it does that one line, but we'll make it work. They did not wear jewelry or use cosmetics or perfume. Like Spartan men, women were expected to be strong and healthy and ready to fight. A woman was expected to look after her husband's property in times of war. She also had to guard it against invaders and revolts from the slaves. Spartan women had many rights that other Greek women did not have. They were free to speak with their husband's friends. They could own and control their own property. They could even marry another man if their first husband had been away at war too long. Spartan slaves, the Helots, were people who had been conquered by the Spartans. There were many more Helots than citizens in Sparta. The Spartans were afraid the Helots would revolt, so they treated them very harshly. The government sometimes declared war on the Helots, so it could legally kill any slaves it thought might rebel. Once the Spartan government asked the Helots to choose their best fighters. The Spartans said these men would be set free as thanks for fighting for Sparta. 2,000 Helots were chosen. Immediately, the Spartans killed every one of them to eliminate any future Helot leaders. Despite this treatment, Helots actually had some rights. They could marry whomever and whenever they wanted. They could pass their names on to their children. They could sell any extra crops that they had after giving their master his share. If they saved enough money, they could even buy their freedom. Okay, so if we look at it, women were treated much differently in Sparta, right? They could own property. They could go out in public. They didn't have to be escorted by a man. They could even talk to friends of their husbands. They could remarry. So life was very different in Sparta for women. Heliots, the slaves in Sparta, they were not considered citizens, but they could earn a living. They could get married. They could save some of their crops as long as they gave enough to their masters. And so life was different for the slaves and the women in Sparta compared to Athens. In this chapter, you have learned about Athens and Sparta, two very different city-states in ancient Greece. Athens was a democracy, though only free men could take part in the government. Its economy depended on trade. Boys were educated to be good citizens. Girls learned skills for managing the household. Women and slaves had far fewer rights than men had. Sparta was more isolated than Athens. It was primarily a military state. Its government was an oligarchy in which a few men held most of the power. The Spartan economy depended on farming and conquest. Boys and girls alike were educated to protect the city-state. Spartan women had more rights than any other Greek women. The city depended on slaves and other non-citizens to provide many of its needs. Athens and Sparta were bitter rivals. But in the next chapter, you'll see how they came together with other Greek city-states to fight a terrible threat to their freedom and independence. And we'll talk a little bit about the war they're talking about, but we're not going to go into a lot of great detail. So this is the information about Sparta. It talks about the economy, the education, the government, and how women and slaves were treated. So you're going to come over, you're going to go, slide number, oops, I'm on the wrong one, 7, and we have Spartan economy, women and slaves, education, Spartan economy, and Spartan government. So you'll fill in the 3 most important facts for each of the subsections. So if you have any questions while you're at home, if you're watching this video, please feel free to email me. If not, have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.